Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is the cheapest 426 Hemi on YouTube. Or at least it will be. Someday, I hope. Now before I go any further with this, I have to give the world's biggest shout out and all of my thanks to Tom Hergert with Rocket Restorations, both the company and the YouTube channel. Without Tom, none of this would be possible. I would not have any of these 426 Hemi parts, with the exception of some very expensive rocker arms, without his help. If you want to help me extend my thanks to Tom, the best way you could do that, if you're not already following him, is to go over to his Rocket Restorations channel and hit the subscribe button. Maybe even tell him I sent you. Like me, Tom is a Mopar hoarder. And some of these Hemi parts have been sitting around for years and years. In fact, quite some time ago now, I did a video about possibly building a 426 out of leftovers in his back room. At that time, there was not quite an entire engine and it didn't happen. But today is a different day. Other important things before we get on with the story. I am not building a 426 Hemi today. In fact, it might be quite a while until I'm doing that. So don't get too excited for it. There are a lot of builds in line in front of this one, but it's gonna happen. You'll notice I said the cheapest 426 Hemi on YouTube, but I did not say cheap. There is no such thing. Hemis are just incredibly expensive. And we'll get into some of that in a minute here. I am no expert on the 426 Hemi, or anything else for that matter. I've never built one. I've built plenty of big block Chryslers, which are very closely related, and of course I've built more than my fair share of small blocks. But I'm learning with the Hemi stuff as I go along. If you happen to be a 426 Hemi expert and you think there's something I need to know, by all means, drop it in the comments. I do read all of those. You may notice one very important part conspicuously missing from this pile of Hemi bits. And that is, of course, the 426 Hemi block. We'll get to that in a minute. I do happen to have this 440 block, which I've set up as a visual demonstrator. I'll be covering a lot of details on the 426 Hemi, but I would never suggest that this is going to be an all-inclusive, totally informative, educational video. I'm sure there's all kinds of content like that out there on the internet. You ought to know something about 426 Hemis if you're living in Mopar world. If you happen to have been in a coma from the mid-60s until like yesterday, or if you're 12, I'll let you know right now that the 426 Hemi was the ultimate engine in the muscle car era at Chrysler. It was the best thing you could order in your 68 or 69 Charger, for example. I put best in quotes because there was another great engine available alongside the 426, namely the 440. I'm not going to argue the point that many people make that the 440 is in fact superior. It's a great engine. There's no question of that. But you know what it isn't? A Hemi. With all of that out of the way, it's time for me to relate to you the story of what I'm calling the leftover elephant. How I came to own all this stuff, what we're looking at exactly here, and what the plan is. Like me, Tom Hergert is a Mopar hoarder. Except he's way better at it. He's been doing it longer, and he's stashed all kinds of cool stuff away. One of Tom's favorite things to do is gallivant across the country, collecting hordes of parts from estates or from people getting out of the Mopar business. A few months ago, Tom bought a horde of E-body parts. Of course, the 426 Hemi was the ultimate engine in those as well for 1970 and 1971. And it just so happens that the owner of this collection had a bunch of Hemi stuff. There were no blocks, no heads, nothing like that. But there were a lot of odds and ends. Bearings, rings, push rods, spark plug tubes, valve gear, and the like. Multiple harmonic balancers, including this rusty old factory piece, which I chose. Because I'm the resident engine guy at Rocket, I was tasked with sorting through all of the engine parts. There was a lot of 383 stuff, but as I dug, I found that there were enough extras there to just about put together a 426 Hemi, at least if someone could come up with the other big pieces. There were a couple larger parts, like valve covers for example. I believe there were 4 in the pile. I brought these 2 home. Now when I got them, they were covered in orange overspray and horrible ancient masking tape because someone had used them to paint a restoration grade 426. Thankfully, my friend Alan took them back to the North Pole, cleaned all of the overspray and tape off, and even got these Dick Landy stickers looking pretty good. They're not perfect, but they're good enough for what I'm doing. There were 2 sets of 7 426 Hemi rods. That's a recurring theme in Hemi land. Yeah, pay attention to that. I set a bunch of these parts to the side and reminded Tom yet again that I would love to build a 426 Hemi. Little did I know, I was about to get lucky there. Another of Tom's favorite activities is going to the big swap meets. And it just so happens that a couple weeks after the pile of Hemi stuff came home, he went to Fall Fling in Van Nuys, California. At that swap meet, he found 2 426 Hemi race blocks. He also found a pair of amazingly crappy 426 Street Hemi heads, which for a while there I thought I was going to have to use. When the better head out of the pair looks like this, that should probably tell you something. There was more interesting old school race stuff in the pile as well, like this. We'll talk about this nightmare later. Apparently, some old racer, or the son of some old racer, was clearing out a hoard of long-abandoned basement-dwelling Mopar stuff. And that's where all of this came from. The prices were reasonable. I mean, the stuff certainly wasn't free, but it was worth bringing home. And I immediately called dibs on one of the blocks. Now, there's something you have to understand about old race engines, and it's one of the big points I want to drive home with this video. When you think race engine, you might be thinking horsepower, performance, speed. What you should be thinking is pure, unadulterated garbage. Beaten, destroyed, welded back together, taken out, beaten, and destroyed again. The average racer is on a budget. Barring the big, fancy, high-dollar factory-backed race teams, or gazillionaires, most of the people you see at the track are just normal, like you or I. And they're getting by with what they have. And these race engines aren't going out and doing thousands of street miles either. So they don't exactly have to be perfect. They just have to get down the track. So, junk like this, not only acceptable, it's kind of just par for the course. My Hemi block is a second run 1964 race Hemi. And what that means is it was never even stuck in a normal passenger car and driven down the street. It was a racing unit from day one, and I guarantee it has been blown up many times. For one thing, the block has 2 sleeves in it, and one of those sleeves has been hit by a rod. So that's at least twice. Also, unlike this beautiful 440 block, my Hemi has a couple windows in the side. Again, normal 426 Hemi race engine stuff. I've been assured by a commenter on a previous Hemi video that the factory rods themselves are not the problem, that the 426 Hemi rods are in fact quite beefy. And I believe them. I mean, look at all that. That's a pretty serious unit. But even this set of rods is not a match set. Look at this. That one's totally different. That one's a little bit different. We might have 4 rods that match, maybe 5. X-race parts? Yeah, they're probably junk. So if there is such a thing as a cheap 426 Hemi, that's what it's made out of. Racers' leftovers. And that's mostly what we've got going on here. Now the good news is, my standards are pretty low. So, I'm all in on making this old school race Hemi block that's been blown up multiple times work again. Unfortunately, it's been to 2 different machine shops now, and both have found really exciting problems. The reason I can set a 426 Hemi head on a 440 block like this is because the 2 blocks are very, very similar. The Hemi is based on the RB wedge block. At the time of its inception, that block was sized at 426 cubic inches, which is why the Hemi is a 426. This, of course, is a 440 with a bigger bore, but the architecture is exactly the same. Aside from the bore and the beef in the bottom end and the cross-bolted mains and the different engine mounts, the main difference is here in the valley. To account for the different head setup, there are little scallops that allow the push rods to go through, and the head mounting setup is a little bit different. There are big ears that are open right here, and there's actually a stud that's installed under every intake port, and a nut you have to put on it right here. For that reason, the casting varies quite a bit in this area. And unfortunately, in one of the areas where the casting kind of dips down, it gets really thin. On my block, when it was magnafluxed, the machine shop found a crack. Repairing iron castings like this is something of a dying art. There are not many people that do it anymore. The only shop that I'm aware of that was anywhere near to here is no longer in business. But I do happen to have a friend that is a trained welder. He's not exactly trained on doing this, but how hard could it be? Yeah, I think there's a crack there.
Well, the good news is it stops right there.
Hemi block repair. Lesson 1. Find a guy that knows how to do stuff. Are you, like, sure about this? Fire.
Oh yeah, look at that. That's cool.
It's just like a gas grill. Did you know these walls are actually really thin? Propane smells. Please don't make any horrible cracking sounds. Well, that was a nice idea. So that's why I don't have a block currently. It's still at Mike's. We're going to regroup and make another attempt at repairing that. Unless, of course, I can find an actual cast iron specialist, which would be great. Incidentally, the reason the block was at the machinist getting cleaned and checked was so it could be line bored. You see, these main caps do not actually match my block. The two blocks had two sets of caps with them, neither of which seemed to actually match either block necessarily. I did the best I could finding the ones that would register in the block right, and I also matched the bearings in these middle three caps to the bearings in the main saddles of my block. So I think the middle three are right. Maybe. The outer two definitely aren't. I know I mentioned the damaged sleeve in my block. There's another bore that's screwed up too, so now it needs at least two sleeves. And hopefully the rest of the cylinders are going to clean up at 30 thou. But we won't know that until the crack is fixed, and it's going to be a while. But I'm really hoping it cleans up at 30 thousandths oversized because I happen to have pistons for that. These are an old school Arius, or however the heck you say that, race Hemi reproduction piston in the 30 over size. Now, the difference between a race Hemi piston and a street Hemi piston is essentially the height of that dome. You can tell right away by looking because the street Hemi piston has a wider looking flat area on top. I'm not building a race engine. I'm building an engine for partying. So I have a need to be able to run this thing on premium pump fuel. These race Hemi pistons are supposed to yield a compression ratio of 12.5 to 1, and that's a little bit excessive for what I'm doing. However, I had a useful comment on the Hemi teardown video a couple weeks ago that really got me thinking, maybe this is the way to go. All 426 Hemi pistons are domed. That dome goes into the chamber in the cylinder head, fills a certain amount of it, and that's what gives you your compression ratio. Or at least that's what gives you your static compression ratio. There are more factors too: piston height, deck height, chamber size. There are a lot of different calculations that go into this, but the long and the short of it is, different size dome equals different static compression ratio. However, dynamic compression is a term that describes the actual effective compression ratio taking into account valve timing events. Essentially, what you can do is use a careful selection of cam lobe profile and cam timing to bleed off compression. Essentially, some of the air and fuel that would be taken in by the cylinder isn't. I don't know the particular specs I'm going to need, and I intend to get people much more intelligent than me in this field involved in cam selection. I'm fairly certain this new old stock comp cam is not going to be what I want. It may be a good grinding core though. Did you know that Hemi valves are gigantic? Well, they are. As mentioned, I was afraid I was going to have to run those totally horrible, massively repaired, destroyed Hemi heads. Luckily, I've since found another option, and it's these. This is a pair of 1970 426 street Hemi heads. I recently removed these heads from a 1970 Hemi Cuda. If you saw that teardown video, you might recognize this stamping from Ed Pink Engines. And you might also remember that these had an issue with valve spring heights. This exhaust valve right in this position could be opened by hand. So while the engine I pulled these off of had a dead hole for years and years, the heads themselves look pretty good. Well, okay, there is a little issue. As you can see, these heads were sent to the machine shop, stripped, cleaned, and checked for cracks. And guess what? If you're not familiar with the term magnaflexing, this is a process that a machine shop will use to check castings for cracks. Essentially, it's a big giant magnetic probe thing and a magic powder that, when sprinkled onto a casting, tends to stick to little cracks that may not be visible to the naked eye. In fact, this is exactly the process Mike and I were using to verify the crack in my block before we made it way worse. I don't know how easily you'll be able to see this, but this entire chamber has been rebuilt. It doesn't have the right texture or the right shape. You can see here, this is perfectly rounded, and this is sort of lumpy. The circle there indicates a crack that was turned up by the Magnaflux. There's a weird squiggly thing here, I think because there are multiple cracks. You can see there's repair in that area, same as over here. Of course, there's water all around the roof of the chamber, and apparently that area is pretty thin. I don't think punching holes in these heads is particularly uncommon. The other head hasn't had that level of hackery or repair, But it's also cracked, again, from a spark plug hole over toward an exhaust valve seat. That appears to be very common with 426 Hemi heads. Here's the thing though. Dead cylinder aside, I removed these from a running engine. It had no issues with eating coolant. It didn't steam. There was no evidence of water on the plugs. I didn't see any jet washed cylinders. So while these heads may be slightly cracked, I think I'm just gonna run them. Especially after my experiences to this point trying to repair cast iron. And the price is right too. All I have to give for this set of slightly cracked, taken apart heads, something like a week or two of my labor putting together the engine they came off of. Something I'm actually really excited to do. Now I mentioned that I've got a race Hemi block, but a set of street Hemi heads. All you really need to know there is either type of heads will bolt onto the block, no problem. The difference between race and street heads, in case you're not hip to it, this edge right here. On the original race heads, it doesn't have this weird little whoopty in it. It's just straight. Apparently on the street Hemi, this was done for accessory clearance. The power steering pump lives over here somewhere, and the race style head would be in the way. I don't think I've explained that what I'm doing to pay for the block and most of this other stuff is a Cummins swap and a crew cab tin grill for Tom. That's a build you'll see on the channel, let's say in the coming months. A couple small machine shop bills notwithstanding, the only thing I've had to spend real money on so far is these rocker arms, which of course are special to the 426 Hemi and hard to find. So I hope you're sitting down when I tell you that I paid $1,850 shipped for these original wide pad 426 Hemi rockers. Compared to the $2,500 they go for on eBay, or the $3,000 plus for a complete new setup, that sounded like a deal. It took a few weeks for them to get here from Australia. I do have to give a big thank you to Luke for packing them nicely and dropping them in the mail for me. The exhaust side rocker on the 426 in particular is amazing. It's so huge, and it like wraps around to reach this valve. The intakes are pretty cool too, but they're not that gigantic. It's not just the rocker arms that make this important, complicated, and expensive though. You can see the springs here. That's one component. You've got the rocker stands, 5 of them. You've got the bolts that secure the tubes to the stands and the tubes themselves, which are actually different between intake and exhaust sides. Unfortunately, it's not all roses and puppy dog kisses with these things. This set is perfect, at least as far as I can tell so far. This set, on the other hand, well, there's a bit of an issue. I knew right away when I took them out of the package and set them down on my steel workbench that there was something funky there. They're like warped from end to end. I went to put them on a cylinder head and they wouldn't even line up on the little dowel pins in here. I had to loosen all of the bolts that secure the tubes to the stands and allow all of that stuff to relax, and then I was able to get them on the pins, but still, they don't sit right. That tells me that either they were bolted to a screwed up repaired head, like that one over there, or something else happened. Maybe someone assembled them and tightened all these bolts down on the bench without actually having them mocked up on a head or something. These rocker shafts are no longer straight. They're kind of bowed in this direction. So that's not good. A 1/4-inch gap is what I seem to have at either end when I get them settled down. So yeah, I'm probably in the market for 2 new rocker shafts. And yes, that does kind of hurt after you spend this kind of money on something. But I did save like $700 on them or more, depending on how you count. So a couple rocker shafts, not the end of the world. All of the other little components are here, so that's great. As mentioned, there's a good chance I'm not using this comp cam. I don't know if these springs are going to be suitable for what I end up using. I don't know if I'll need these keepers or different keepers. I have no idea. I don't know if I'll use those ancient valve seals. I suspect I will be using these lash caps. That apparently is a good way to make sure your not so accurate factory 426 rocker tips contact the valve more reliably. In general, I'm not 100% on any of this top end stuff. As with every other engine I have ever built, I do not have a horsepower goal in mind for this. I have no idea what it could make. A 426 Hemi should make 500 horsepower like that. I don't need more than that. I don't need 500, frankly. All I want is a runnable 426 Hemi. I am missing some various engine dress items, timing cover, oil pan, oil pickup. The pickup is special to the Hemi, and the pan technically is as well. I do not have an intake manifold. Of course, this thing is getting dual quads, one way or another. I think more likely than anything else, I'll probably just buy the modern Edelbrock dual quad manifold. I certainly don't need the reproduction Pentastar part number marked unit, and I will not have the exhaust preheat tubes that usually run to the back of the intake. So the Edelbrock unit, probably the way to go. I need a timing cover, but that's typical big block stuff. Should be fine there. Ditto, water pump housing, oil pump. Mounting the 426 Hemi is a little tricky because they do not have these ears. The reason the ears were removed is because, at least on the driver's side, the exhaust manifold would interfere with those. So they're chopped off, and there's a 3-bolt mounting pad down here next to the dipstick hole. I'm going to be getting conversion mounts from Schumacher to stick this engine in a B-body. I detailed my plans for my crappy 69 Charger in a previous video. You'll notice absolutely nothing has happened with it since then. We'll get there. Anyway, the 500-ish horsepower engine I alluded to was this one. That is my plan. I think it's going to live under the hood of that car. But I will tell you, I've got my eye out for a more suitable candidate. I'd really like a 68 Roadrunner with a Hemi under the hood. That just seems perfect to me. The other good choice would be a first-year street Hemi car, a 66 Coronet or a Charger, ideally, although I could do a Belvedere as well. Having the engine, just owning it, and bolting it together, having it complete, and being able to run it on our break-in stand at Rocket, that's way more important to me than like putting it in a car. I just want it. I've always wanted one of these, and I'm so excited that I can almost taste it from where I'm standing now. Just understand that my plan may change. I'm gonna have a Hemi, and it may be in this car, or maybe not. I also have a Rowdy 440 that would do very cool things in there. And yes, I have considered putting it in the 68, but I'm just not going to do that. I've covered most of the components I have, but I do want to direct your attention to this crankshaft. This is a factory Hemi unit, which you can tell by the 8-bolt flange at the back, unlike the 6-bolt flange found in the regular big blocks. This thing has been welded up and ground back to factory specifications. It's also finished with a process that I think my machinist called hard chroming. I'm no expert on that. The journals look pretty nice, except for a couple of them, which do have some porosity in the welds. I'm not sure if that's going to be an issue or not. My machinist seemed to think it would probably be fine. Remember, of course, while I will be driving this thing around, it's never going to do 10,000 miles, so the requirements may not be as high for this engine as for some others. If we decide this crank is not suitable, there are like 5 more Hemi cranks in Tom's stash, and in a pinch, we could even use a regular 440 crank, no problem. But for now, I think we're going to be sticking with this one. I've already got standard main and rod bearings to match too. I even have rings. Ah yes, in that stash of Hemi parts was a brand new set of ARP main bolts, so I've got those. I don't have head bolts yet. I think I'm going to be using the goofy takeoffs from these heads, that 70 Hemi Cuda engine, but I may just buy ARPs. I'm still blown away by the fact that I found these rods in the back room at Rocket. Why does every set of Hemi parts only come with 7 good rods? 7 at best, really. Hey, this is a no bird zone! So I was strongly considering using 440 rods because we've got a lot of them. But I think I just struck gold in the back room at Rocket. Those are not Hemi pistons, but those sure look like ground and polished Hemi rods. Dude, it's my lucky day. They were attached to what appeared to be 413 max wedge pistons. Of course, the 413 is the earlier RB engine, much like the 426 and the 440. Why someone would use Hemi rods for this? Well, the ultimate beef, I suppose. As you can see, these things have been ground and polished, because race car. I incorrectly explained what that process is meant to accomplish in a previous video. Essentially, smoothing the surfaces out like that is supposed to eliminate the possibility of a stress fracture leading to a crack and the rods, doing 426 Hemi things. If you're not hip to it, these are spark plug tubes. They go through the head like this, down around the spark plug. Now, rather annoyingly in the 426, when you remove the plug, the seal between the tube and the head is broken and oil pours into the bores. So, some genius came up with these little cups. These go down in the head around the spark plug and prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, I only have 4. I'm gonna have to insist on putting those in this thing, so I'll be buying some more. This is a chrome dome. Well, it's a chrome dome lid. You would have found this under the hood of your 68 Hemi Charger. So I think it's pretty cool. Obviously, it's got some extra holes drilled in it, and there's also a chunk cut out of it right there. This was hanging on the wall at Rocket forever and ever, and Tom let me take it. It obviously needs a good polish job. I'm fairly certain that's going to end up on this engine. It also might not. In addition to different sized rocker arms, these engines also use different push rods between intake and exhaust. As you can see, I have a set of shiny new exhaust push rods and good used intake push rods. I also grabbed some gaskets out of the pile. There are two Felpro stamped steel replacement head gaskets there, and on top, TTI header gaskets, which I almost certainly will not use. I'm a strong believer in Remflex. It's like $45–50. It's good insurance against header leaks. Speaking of headers, I did show you these already. These are ancient hooker headers, which as you can see have been well used, beaten. They have crankcase breathers, and they've been sitting around in the back room at Rocket forever. Found the Hemi headers, but they're kind of hard to get to. I'm about to cause a crank avalanche. Really good chance that wasn't worth all the trouble. I don't actually know 100% that these are B-body headers. I think they are, but they do vary quite a bit from the headers you can buy today. I guess I'm not going to figure that out for a while. Now, I would be remiss if I did not tell you at this point that putting together a 426 Hemi out of leftover racer scraps is not exactly a new idea. You see, Uncle Tony wrote an article years ago called Hemi on a Shoestring in which he did essentially the same exact thing. I've yet to be able to find a copy of that online to read. The good news is, because I'm lucky enough to be friends with Uncle Tony, I could just ask him for advice, and I'm probably going to have to do that a lot. I suppose that's about it, which is good, because it's like 9 p.m. or something. In the coming weeks, I'm really hoping we can get the cast iron repair figured out on the block and get that back over to the machine shop. It still needs a line board job, at least 2 sleeves, probably refinished decks, who knows what else. From there, we'll get the bores finished, and assuming they wind up at 30 thou, I'll take these pistons and rods down there, along with the crank. I'll get this entire assembly balanced, and we'll be just about ready to build the 426 Hemi of my dreams. Again, if you're knowledgeable on the 426 and you have some input that you think would be helpful for this build, please do not hesitate to drop that in the comments. Or you can always shoot me an email at deaddodgegarage@gmail.com. In the previous Hemi teardown video, I did mention that I was going to be looking for some Hemi parts. I had a few commenters say they might have parts to sell me, but I never heard from any of them. If you've got Hemi parts that might be better than what I've got here, say a couple of rocker shafts or heads that aren't cracked, please do get in contact with me. I'm not looking for free, but I am looking for affordable. Just keep that in mind. Anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this look at an upcoming project I'm really looking forward to. Sometime before long, we'll be making 426 Hemi noises with this pile of junk, and I'm really looking forward to it. Until next time, as ever, thank you very much for watching. And remember, the trail is long and full of horrors, yet I inch forward regardless.